Greetings adventurers and welcome to the MicFlayers podcast. My name is Martin O'Dwyer and I'll be your host for today's video. And if you, like me, devoured the most recent season of Stranger Things as soon as it came out, you probably noticed that yet again D&D has a very strong influence on the plotline of this season. We've seen it from the very first episode of the show where we meet Will, Mike, Dustin and Lucas right smack in the middle of a D&D session, and that's carried on throughout the seasons with the naming conventions of the villains that our heroes face against. We have the Demogorgon, we've had the MicFlayer, and in this season, season 4, we have Vecna, one of D&D's biggest bads. But it's not just the otherworldly threats this season that are related to D&D. No, this season, the Duffer Brothers, the creators of Stranger Things, have delved into one of the darker episodes of D&D's history to bring us a new and interesting storyline. Right now is probably a good time to say, if you have not watched the most recent season of Stranger Things, probably pause this video, go finish it, or come back to this video when you've watched the whole thing, because I am going to be spoiling quite significant elements of the plot in one specific plot line. But if you're all caught up, let's go ahead and talk about Stranger Things, D&D, and the Satanic Panic. So I hear you ask, what actually was the Satanic Panic? Well, in its simplest form, the Satanic Panic was a moral panic amongst more conservative Christian parents and public figures who saw D&D as a corrupting influence on their kids. They believed it to be demonic, they believed it to be satanic, they believed it to be blasphemous and encouraging non-traditional American values and corrupting their youth and causing them to commit horrible and heinous crimes and do all of this terrible, horrific stuff that was being blasted out over the airwaves. And as soon as the televangelists and the right-wing kind of TV hosts all got a hold of this, and particularly the right-wing tabloid media at the time, they had a complete field day with this. Any kind of a small sniff of something that possibly in the tiniest way could have been considered satanic or demonic, that was like a red rag to a bull to these people. And as we go on in this video, we will get into who are the main figures in the Satanic Panic and who are the people who really caused it to kick up and stir up and become this huge controversy that dogged D&D for a good decade.
D&D, it's become popular with children anywhere from grammar school on up. Not so with a lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders. The idea of the game, which is played by highly imaginative and intelligent kids, is to assume the role of one of the characters. One game can go on for weeks or even months. The problem seems to be that some kids take it more seriously than others, take it a step further, playing a character who brings them the power in a game they couldn't possibly get in real life.
So if the Satanic Panic was this huge moral panic spreading through conservative areas of America during the 80s, who were the key figures behind it? Who were the people that were pushing this agenda? Well, generally speaking, it was, as I said, conservative Christian elements in American society during the time. There were your televangelists, your preachers, your concerned parents, all of these people that saw a group of kids spending a lot of time in a fantasy world and thought there was something wrong with that. Instead of seeing that they were just seeking shelter and finding a little bit of peace for themselves outside the norm, they saw something inherently negative in this. And there's a couple of main figures in this. One of the most, probably the most one of the most influential and most serious incidents related to this would be the death of Irving Bink Pulling II. He was a deeply troubled individual who sought shelter in D&D and unfortunately during a mental health crisis did indeed take his own life. This led to rumours about him prior to this living in an underground tunnel system under the school. This also led to his mother Patricia Pulling becoming one of the most vocal critics of D&D throughout the 80s. She even went on to found an organisation called BADD, B-A-D-D, which stands for Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. That was an organisation created and set up to fight the demonic influence of D&D in 80s America. We also had people like Jack Chick, around the time of 1984 began to publish the Chick Tracts, which were these extremely vocally anti-D&D propaganda pieces. Basically, they were hit pieces on the game, often accompanied by cartoons depicting the supposed satanic activities that children were getting up to playing this game. Murder, human sacrifice, kidnapping, the whole 9 yards. Anything wild and satanic that you can think of, it was basically blamed on D&D by this guy. We also had things like conservative Christian preachers and televangelists screaming to national audiences from their pulpits about how D&D was wrong, how it was demonic, how it was evil, how it was causing all of these children and all these people to go out and become devil worshippers and kidnap people and sacrifice them to summon demons. You had stories from parents saying that they walked into their child's bedroom and saw them summon a demon from the monster manual. It's really, it's a farce, really, but sadly it was something that people took very seriously instead of the joke that it realistically was if you looked at it with any kind of a sensible viewpoint here. And this really caught on, and it became a serious headache for D&D for most of the 80s. Patricia Pullen, who was previously mentioned, the mother of Irving Pullen, who sadly died, she actually went on to sue not only the principal of the high school that her son went to for allowing D&D to be on the campus, but she also went ahead and tried to sue TSR, the creators, the makers of D&D. And as a result of stuff like this, we can see we have internal memos from TSR where they're agreeing that they need to kind of pull back on this occult stuff, because what so many of these parents and these religious figures and these campaigners had problems with were the biblical or supernatural events and references that were held in the text of the book, stuff like resurrections, walking on water, which they saw as blasphemous, as they were things that happened in the Bible, as well as references to demons, summoning demons, and spells that they all saw as occultism and leading their children down a dark path. Now, anyone with their head straight on their shoulders can tell that D&D is just a game of playing dice and telling a story together with your friends. But to these people, they saw a bunch of kids pretending to be elves and dwarves and whatever else in their basements, rolling some dice as literal pawns of the devil. It's insane, and it just continued this pile on for most of the 80s. However, it did fade out as we got towards the 90s, where more moral panics then set in. In the 90s you had moral panics about heavy metal as well, and we'll actually come back to that in a little bit, where we talk when I'm going to talk about the after effects of the Satanic Panic and what kind of hang-ups we have left over from that. And you know, it was actually it was a full-blown campaign. It was like a political campaign. It was a media campaign. Some of the works that were being done, the anti-D&D propaganda publications, stuff like the Chick Tracts, they ended up going on and inspiring a book called Mazes and Monsters, which was then made into an awful movie, which funnily enough happens to star Tom Hanks. The actual gist of the story is that Tom Hanks plays a kid who got into D&D and now isn't able to differentiate between real life and D&D, and he thinks he's this character. And the film literally ends with him standing on top of a crane or a tower and about to jump off because he can cast fly, he has enough points, and the maze controller, Dungeon Master, has to come along and tell him the game is over, and he's the maze controller is the only one with the authority to tell Tom Hanks, don't jump off this tower, because Tom Hanks is so far gone into D&D, he cannot differentiate, Mazes and Monsters, he cannot differentiate from real life and the fantasy of the game. It's nuts. If you don't believe me, here's a clip.
Robbie! Pardue, what are you doing?
Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't, it's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
Maze controller?
Yes. And I have absolute authority in this game.
Game?
Game.
TJ, what am I doing here?
You gotta love that. DJ, what am I doing here? From future Oscar winner Tom Hanks. But yes, moving on from Mazes and Monsters and the other horrible media, anti-D&D media that was created around the time, like the Chick Tracks, we can move on now to talk a little bit about what were the kind of lasting effects, or what were the consequences of this panic, of all these people suddenly getting up in arms about D&D and about children playing a children's game. Well, as you do see in Stranger Things, people like Eddie Munson, people who were outcasts, people who didn't fit in with society, who didn't follow the grain, who didn't go with the flow, those kind of people who were different, who sought shelter in D&D from what was most likely a rather unfriendly real world, people who sought shelter in a fantasy world that they could tell stories within their friends and be safe and be happy and feel like they have some modicum of power that they didn't have in their real life. Well, these people were suddenly being tarred with the brushes of being murderers and devil worshippers and kidnappers and just horrible, just the worst kinds of criminals, when in reality all that they were doing was rolling some dice and telling stories so that they could find a little peace for themselves and their friends. You also had things like with the creators of D&D, they initially released a supplement called Deities and Demigods. Well, this proved to only add more fuel to the fire, and that was quietly later rebranded to Legends and Lore, and that was directly related to the pressure put on them by people like Bad, by people like Patricia Pulling, by people like Jack Chick and all the rest of the conservative media establishment. This was a direct response to that, to try and, not that they were giving in to that pressure per se, but really just to try and avoid any further headaches. You already had stuff like, there was an episode of 60 Minutes where Patricia Pulling came on with a psychiatrist who claimed that violence and violent movies and things like that were causing the downfall of American society, and he believed that D&D, which was a game that was so centered around violence in terms of fighting monsters and things like that, that it was poison for the soul, that it was corrupting minds and leading young men and young women down the roads of murder, suicide, kidnapping, drugs, all of these kinds of things.
Dungeons and Dragons. At first regarded as a harmless game of make-believe, now has both parents and psychologists concerned. Studies have linked violent behavior to the game, saying it promotes satanic worship, ritual sacrifice, sodomy, suicide, and even murder.
You also had, as I mentioned earlier, there was another moral panic that was creeping in that was very much related to the one about D&D, which was the moral panic regarding heavy metal music. Heavy metal culture, quite like D&D, dabbled in a lot of the same occult stylings. Look at any like power metal album, any like Manowar album, you're gonna see like hell, demons, dragons, pentagrams, rituals, human sacrifice, all of this kind of crazy stuff that was specifically put on heavy metal albums to be provocative to these conservative Christian people. But again, that only fed into their own paranoia about D&D, or in this case heavy metal, and we saw it again later on in the 90s after the events of the Columbine tragedy, where people like Marilyn Manson and Twisted Sister were brought into court to defend their music, to say that they were not trying to kill their audience. Dee Schneider of Twisted Sister famously took to the stand and said, "I'm a musician, why would I try and kill the people who buy my music?" Now, I'm paraphrasing, but it was to that effect. So you could really see it all just got caught up in this insane tornado of just spin and propaganda, and just became this massive moral panic. And fun fact, that's actually where we get the parental advisory sticker from on album covers. That's directly from a Satanic Panic. Now, not necessarily this one related to D&D, but absolutely it is tangentially at the very least related. And you can see that. You can see all this craziness, all what these crazy false beliefs about like D&D being some kind of a crazy cult. All of this is poured directly into Stranger Things Season 4, into the basketball team, into their paranoia about what happened to Chrissy, into Zach, I believe is his name, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, who basically rallies the whole town after a D&D club.
Eddie Munson, He's a part of that freak devil cult Hellfire.
You have people out in their cars chasing them down, buying guns, buying all these crazy weapons. Even at the very end of the series, spoiler, the series ends with a news report talking about how Eddie Munson and local cult, the Hellfire Club, may have opened a portal to hell, which has caused all of the problems that Hawkins currently faces. You can see the Duffers, they really did basically synthesize the essence of the Satanic Panic and how it relates to D&D, and they beautifully implemented that in this season to create a real world, or rather a more mundane antagonist than the otherworldly Vecna for our heroes to come up against. Folks, that's going to be it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed making this a lot. I always love getting to flex my research muscles and go and do a bit of digging into the past, and particularly when it's something like this and related to D&D. As a heavy metal fan, it was something I was also aware of anyway, so it's always fun to be able to combine some of my favourite interests. If you have any questions, comments or queries, please do leave them down below. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at So Sorry It's Over. You can follow the channel on Twitter at MicFlayers Pod. We also have a long form podcast that we do every Friday. It is currently on a break, but we do have quite a large backlog where we talk about different topics every single week. But thank you once again. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you would like to see more, you can always like and subscribe. Have a great day, folks, and keep playing D&D.